A man knows when something ain't right in his own house even if he don't want to admit it. Folks can talk all they want about gut feelings, but when you've spent your life reading people, you know the signs. And I knew. Name's Victor Dalton. Been sheriff of Lone Pine, Texas, for over 30 years. Hell, I was born here, raised here, and I'll probably die here. The town's not much, couple thousand people, a main street with an old diner, a gas station, a post office that barely keeps its doors open. It's quiet mostly. The kind of place where folks nod when they pass, where men take their coffee black and their words serious. I spent my life keeping order here, making sure people felt safe. A man ought to know his duty. I married Anita back when she was barely out of high school. She was young, full of life, always moving, always laughing. She had this way of making a room feel lighter, and back then, I figured that's what a man like me needed. I was already set in my ways, serious, steady. She was a spark, something different. But sparks burn out, don't they? Lately, she'd been different. Restless. Slipping out more, brushing me off when I asked where she was going. Little things at first, smudged lipstick even when she swore she hadn't put any on, perfume stronger than usual, laughter that didn't quite reach me anymore. And the phone. That damn phone never left her hand. She used to talk to me about her day. Now, it was just her fingers tapping that screen, her eyes flicking up with some half-hearted excuse when I walked in the room. I didn't press. Not yet. Hank, the old bartender down at the Rusty Spur, was the one who dropped the first real hint. I'd known Hank as long as I'd had a badge. He ran the kind of bar where men drank to forget their problems but never forgot who was watching. I stopped in one night, same as always, ordered my usual whiskey neat, nothing fancy. Victor, Hank said, leaning against the counter, drying a glass. You've been around a long time. You know I don't go sticking my nose where it don't belong. I looked up from my drink. That's so. He nodded toward the far end of the bar where a man sat hunched over a beer, long hair falling past his shoulders, tattoos running down his arms. The kind of fella who thought rules didn't apply to him. A musician, if you called what he did music. That one there, Hank said. Been seeing your wife. I let the words settle. Took another sip of whiskey. Didn't flinch. You sure about that? Seen him twice now. Logan, close? Not the kind of way a married woman ought to be with another man. He wiped the counter, looking anywhere but at me. Figured you'd want to know. I did. But I didn't let it show. I finished my drink, left a few bills on the bar, and walked out like nothing had changed. But everything had. I took the long way home, past the diner where Anita and I used to sit in the mornings, her stirring sugar into her coffee while I read the paper. Past the old church where I'd seen more weddings than I could count, most of them doomed before the ink on the license dried. Down Main Street, where the eccentric street musician, Billy Ray, played on the corner, strumming his guitar, grinning like he knew a secret. Sheriff, he called, winking. Ain't love a tricky thing? I didn't answer. Just kept walking. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, and Anita's car was parked out front like she'd been home all evening. I stepped inside, the smell of her perfume thick in the air. She was on the couch, curled up like she hadn't just been running around town. You're home late, she said, not looking up from her phone. Yeah. I hung my hat on the rack, kicked off my boots. Stopped by Hank's. She tensed just enough for me to see it. Oh. Heard something interesting. She set her phone down, stretched like she was bored. Small town. People talk. Yeah, I said, voice steady. They do. I didn't say anything else. Just let the silence stretch between us. Let her feel it. She got up, kissed me on the cheek like she thought that'd make it all go away, then walked off to bed. I stood there a while, staring at the empty doorway, my hands curled into fists. A man knows when something ain't right in his own house. And now I had proof. I didn't sleep that night. Just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the fan, the occasional rustle of Anita shifting beside me. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't been out running around town with some long-haired son of a bitch while I was keeping this town safe. At some point, she reached over in her sleep, her hand brushing my arm. I didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just stared at the dark until the sun started creeping through the curtains. By morning, I had a plan. Anita moved around the kitchen like she always did, fixing herself coffee, scrolling through her phone with one hand, barely looking up. I sat at the table, watching. She used to hum while she made breakfast, used to ask if I wanted eggs, toast, something before I headed out. Now she didn't ask. Didn't seem to notice I was sitting right there. You workin' late again? She asked, still looking at her screen. Maybe. I sipped my coffee. Kept my voice even. What about you? She paused just enough for me to catch it. Same as usual. Aha! I let the silence settle, then pushed my chair back. Well, you have yourself a good day. She glanced up, finally meeting my eyes, but I didn't wait for whatever excuse she was working on. Just grabbed my hat and walked out the door. At the station, Caleb was already at his desk, flipping through paperwork, fresh-faced and eager like always. Kid had a good head on his shoulders, still learning the ropes, but he'd make a fine sheriff one day. "Mornin', Sheriff," he said, nodding as I walked in. "You all right?" "Yeah." I tossed my keys on the desk, leaned back in my chair. "Got a favor to ask." He sat up straighter, ready to prove himself. "Anything." I pulled out a notepad, wrote down a name. Ryan Slade. Claims he's a musician. See if he's got anything on record. Outstanding warrants, unpaid fines, trouble in other towns. I slid the paper across the desk. Caleb frowned, flipping through the case files on his screen. "Something I should know?" "Not yet." He nodded, knowing better than to ask more. The morning passed slow. I made my usual rounds, stopping by the diner, chatting with folks, keeping an ear open. People in Lone Pine knew me, trusted me. They didn't say much outright, but I caught the way some of them hesitated when I mentioned Anita. The way old Mrs. Harper, who worked the register at the grocery store, looked like she wanted to say something but just gave me a tight smile instead. By noon, Caleb had something. He knocked on my door, a few papers in hand. "Nothing major," he said, setting them down. "Couple of minor drug charges from back in Austin, some bar fights. Looks like he don't stay in one place too long." That was enough for me. That evening, I parked down the street from the rusty spur, engine off, watching. Took my time, waited. Sure enough, around 9, Anita pulled up, stepped out of her car looking like she'd taken extra care tonight. Tighter jeans, a little too much makeup. She checked her phone, then walked inside. 5 minutes later, Ryan Slade strolled in after her. I didn't go in. Didn't need to. Just sat there, watching the neon sign flicker, listening to the low hum of music leaking through the walls. They came out about an hour later, laughing. She touched his arm. He leaned in close, whispered something that made her smile. Then, just like that, they got in his truck and drove off. I followed. They didn't go far, just a rundown little motel off the highway, the kind where folks went when they didn't want to be seen. He parked. She got out. I sat there a long time, watching the lights in that motel window flick on. By the time I drove home, the rage had settled into something colder, something solid. I didn't slam doors or throw things. Didn't wake her up when I walked into the house and saw her purse sitting on the counter like she hadn't just been out wrecking our marriage. I just poured myself a drink, sat down, and started planning how I was going to burn her world to the ground. I woke up before the sun the way I always did. Anita was still asleep, curled up under the blankets like nothing had changed. Maybe for her, nothing had. Maybe she figured she'd keep playing both sides, coming home to a warm bed while sneaking off with that bastard whenever she wanted. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled on my boots slow, let the leather creak loud enough that she stirred. She blinked up at me, still half asleep. "You're up early," she mumbled. I tied the laces tight, didn't look at her. "Lot to do." She rolled over, pulling the blanket higher. "Yeah, me too, I bet." I left without another word, stopped by the station first thing. Caleb was already there, looking at me like he had something to say. He hesitated a second, then closed the file in front of him. "You sure you're all right, Sheriff?" I looked at him, the kid still green behind the ears, still believing life was mostly fair if you played it straight. I could have told him the truth. Could have told him I'd spent half the night watching my wife walk into a cheap motel with another man. Instead, I just grabbed my coffee from the pot. Just another day, Caleb. But it wasn't. Not for me. I spent the morning making calls. First to Anita's job. HR departments were funny places, full of people who didn't want trouble but also lived off gossip. I used a burner phone, kept it short. Just a tip about inappropriate conduct between an employee and someone outside the company. Enough to plant the seed. Then I called an old buddy over in Austin, a PI who owed me a favor. "I need everything you can find on Ryan Slade," I told him. "Where he's been, who he's pissed off. Anything that makes him look worse than he already does. Must be a hell of a reason, he said. Yeah, I said, swirling the last of my coffee. You could say that. By the afternoon, I had what I needed. Turns out Ryan had a history of skipping rent, pissing off bar owners, and leaving town before folks could come collect. Word was he owed money to a promoter down in Houston. The kind of man who didn't like being stiffed. I sat at my desk, tapping a pen against the wood, thinking it through. I didn't want just a confrontation. That was too easy. I wanted them to feel it. That night, I set up a new email account, sent a message to Anita's boss. Kept it polite, professional. Just a concerned citizen reaching out about workplace behavior. Attached a couple of pictures. Anita and Ryan outside the bar, laughing too close, her hand on his chest. Didn't take much. Just enough to raise eyebrows. Next, I sent a message to that promoter in Houston. Told him where Ryan was, what bar he'd been playing at, even the motel he was holed up in. Figured that'd get someone's attention. By the time I shut the laptop, I felt lighter. Not happy, not satisfied, but steady. Controlled. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. The next day, things started moving fast. Anita came home looking rattled, slamming the door harder than usual. What's wrong? I asked, keeping my face blank. She ran a hand through her hair, pacing the kitchen. Work's being weird. HR pulled me into a meeting today. Someone sent in a complaint about me and... She hesitated, swallowed. And Ryan. I took a slow sip of my coffee. That so? She shot me a look. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I raised an eyebrow. Should I? She stared at me, searching, but I kept my face still. I'd spent too many years dealing with criminals, liars, people who thought they could outtalk me. She wasn't any different. After a long pause, she grabbed her purse. I need some air, she muttered. Take all the time you need, I said. I watched her walk out, knowing damn well she was heading straight to Ryan. Knew she'd be telling him something was off, that people were watching, that maybe it was time to lay low. I also knew that wasn't an option for him anymore. Because by the time she got there, Ryan was going to have problems a hell of a lot bigger than me. I gave it a few hours before heading down to the Rusty Spur. The place was quieter than usual. Just a few regulars nursing beers and minding their own business. I spotted Hank behind the bar, wiping down a glass like he'd been expecting me. He nodded toward the corner booth. Your boy's got company. I followed his gaze. Ryan Slade sat hunched over, looking twitchy, a little too alert. He wasn't alone. A man in a dark jacket sat across from him, older, lean, the kind of guy you didn't want knocking on your door if you owed him money. He was talking low, calm, but his posture said otherwise. Ryan looked like a rat caught in a trap. I strolled over, slow, deliberate, just enough to let them know I was there. Ryan glanced up, face pale under the dim bar lights. Well, if it ain't Sheriff Dalton, he muttered, trying to sound casual. I pulled up a chair, sat down without asking. The other man barely glanced at me, just kept tapping a cigarette against the table, waiting. Small town, I said. Hard not to bump into folks. Ryan swallowed, shifting in his seat. Look, man. Don't look, man me. I rested an elbow on the table, steady. Got a real simple question for you, Slade. How long you plan on sticking around? He forced a laugh, but it died quick. Ain't none of your business. I leaned in just a little. See, that's where you're wrong. I let my eyes drift to the man across from him, the one who hadn't said a damn word yet. Friend of yours. Ryan's jaw tightened. The man smirked, flicked his cigarette onto the table. Just catching up. Ain't that right, Slade? His voice was smooth, almost amused. Ryan wiped a hand over his face. I was gonna pay you, man. Was? I am. Just need a little more time. The man sat back, gave him a long, slow look. Time's up, Slade. I pushed back from the table, stood. You boys got business. Don't let me interrupt. Just figured I'd drop in. See if anyone needed help. Ryan shot me a look that was half plea, half panic. Come on, Sheriff. Seems like a personal matter, I said. Not my concern. I adjusted my hat, met the other man's gaze. Long as it don't spill into my town, we don't have a problem. The man nodded, just once. Message received. I walked out, let the door swing shut behind me. Anita was waiting when I got home, pacing the living room. As soon as I stepped inside, she turned on me, arms crossed tight. What did you do? I set my hat on the rack, unbuttoned my cuffs. You'll have to be more specific. Don't play dumb, Victor. Ryan called me, said some guys came looking for him. I poured myself a drink, took my time. That's so? Her eyes flashed. You set him up. I swirled the glass, watched the whiskey catch the light. I didn't make him a liar. I didn't make him a cheater. And I sure as hell didn't make him stupid enough to piss off the wrong people. She took a step closer, voice dropping. This isn't just about him, is it? I met her eyes, held them. No, Anita. It's about you. She went quiet, shoulders tense, mouth pressed into a hard line. I took a slow sip. Got anything else to say? She did, but not to me. She grabbed her purse, stormed out the door, same way she always did when she wanted to feel in control. Only this time she didn't come back. 2 weeks passed and Anita still hadn't come home. She didn't call, didn't leave a note. Just packed up whatever she could fit in her car and took off like she never belonged here in the first place. I reckon she thought she was leaving me in the dust, like I'd be sitting on the porch with my head in my hands, wondering where it all went wrong. She was wrong. Lone Pine kept moving, same as always. People nodded a little longer when they saw me, some tipping their hats like they knew more than they let on. Small towns were like that. No secrets, just quiet understandings. I focused on my work. Did my rounds, checked in on folks, handled what needed handling? If anything, I felt lighter. No more walking into my own home and feeling like a stranger. No more wondering where she was or who she was with. One afternoon I was sitting in my office when the phone rang. I answered on instinct, not expecting much, but the voice on the other end made me sit up. Hey, Dad. Sarah. I hadn't heard from my daughter in months, maybe longer. She lived up in Dallas, built herself a life away from me, away from Lone Pine. We didn't talk much. Her choice, mostly. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice steady. Well, hell. Thought you forgot your old man existed. She let out a dry laugh. Guess I got caught up in things. A pause. I heard about Anita. News traveled fast. What exactly did you hear? That she took off, Sarah said. And that you might have had something to do with it. I smiled a little. I didn't put her in that car, sweetheart. She made her own choices. Silence stretched between us. I could hear the city behind her, the faint hum of traffic, people moving fast like they always did up there. You all right? She asked, finally. It had been a long time since she asked me anything like that. I'm fine, I said. Better, actually. She hesitated. You want to grab lunch sometime? Maybe catch up. I kept my tone casual, like this wasn't something I'd been hoping to hear for years. Yeah, that sounds good. She let out a breath, almost like relief. All right, I'll call you. I hung up, sat there for a while, staring at the phone. That night, I went to the Rusty Spur. Caleb was already there, sitting at the bar nursing a beer, looking like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. I slid onto the stool next to him, nodded to Hank for a whiskey. Caleb turned to me. So, she's really gone? I took a sip, let the burn settle. Looks that way. You okay with that? I looked around the bar, at the familiar faces, at the town I'd spent my whole life protecting. Then I glanced at the door, the one Anita used to walk through, laughing, flirting, looking for something she thought she was missing. Yeah, I said, setting my glass down. I think I am. A few more months passed and Anita stayed gone. No calls, no messages, nothing. That suited me just fine. I figured she was out there chasing whatever it was she thought she wanted, excitement, freedom, maybe just the feeling of being someone else for a while. But the thing about running is, eventually you run out of road. I kept my focus where it belonged. The town, my work, rebuilding what mattered. Sarah and I started talking more. It was slow, cautious, like neither of us wanted to say the wrong thing and send the other one packing again. But we met for lunch one Saturday, then another. By the third time she asked about Anita and I told her the truth. She made her choices, I said, cutting into my steak, not looking up. Sarah stirred her iced tea with her straw, watching me. And you? You made yours too. I met her eyes. Damn right. She nodded, like that was the answer she expected. Like she respected it. We didn't talk about it again after that. No need. Some things don't need rehashing. They just are. Work stayed steady. Lone Pine had its usual nonsense, bar fights, land disputes, kids getting caught where they shouldn't be. Nothing I hadn't seen 100 times before. But I felt different. Lighter. Like I wasn't carrying something around anymore. Then, one cold evening, just as the sun dipped low over the fields, a car rolled into my driveway. I was sitting on the porch, boots kicked up, watching the sky turn gold and purple. Anita stepped out, looking thinner, older somehow. Not in years, but in weight, like life had worn her down faster than it should have. Her hair was pulled back, her clothes plain. No makeup. She looked at me across the yard, waiting for me to react. I just took a slow sip of my coffee. She took a breath, then walked up the steps. "Hey, Victor." I set my cup down. "Anita." She hesitated, shifting on her feet. I didn't know where else to go. I studied her, taking my time. She wasn't the woman who left. Whatever she'd been chasing, she didn't find it. Or maybe she did, and it wasn't what she thought it'd be. Either way, she was here now, standing in front of me, broken more ways than one. "You hungry?" I finally asked. She let out a breath, like she'd been bracing for something worse. "Yeah." I got up, went inside, fixed her a plate of leftovers. Sat it down in front of her at the kitchen table. She ate slow, careful, like she wasn't used to a meal anymore. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You look rough." She gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Yeah. Life's got a way of humbling you." I didn't respond, just let her eat. After a while, she set her fork down. "I messed up." I nodded. "Yep." She sighed, rubbing her hands together. "I lost my job. Couldn't find another one after everything. Ryan took off, guess he figured out I wasn't worth the trouble. Thought I had friends, turns out I didn't." She glanced at me. Guess I should have seen that coming. I didn't say anything. Just let her sit with it. Finally, she looked up. "I don't expect anything from you. I know I don't deserve help, but I needed to see you." I nodded toward the door. "There's an old motel down by the highway. I'll cover your first few nights. After that, you figure it out." She swallowed hard, but she didn't argue. Just nodded, eyes down. I grabbed my wallet, pulled out a few bills, set them on the table. "Not 'cause I forgive you," I said, voice steady. "Just 'cause I ain't like you." She nodded again, slow. "I know." I walked her to the door, watched her get back in her car. She looked at me one last time, but I didn't wave. Didn't say anything. Just stood there as she pulled away, taillights fading into the dark. When I turned back to the house, I felt nothing. No anger. No regret. Just peace. A few more years went by and life settled into something steady. The town stayed the same, more or less. New folks came in, old folks passed on, but Lone Pine had a way of keeping its bones, holding on to what mattered. I stayed on as sheriff a little longer than I planned, just to make sure Caleb was ready when I finally hung up my badge. He was. The day I turned in my star, I didn't make a speech or shake a bunch of hands. Just walked into the office, put it on the desk, and nodded at Caleb. "You'll do just fine," I said. He stood there, looking like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just gave a firm nod. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Victor," I corrected. That evening, I drove out to the ranch I'd bought just outside town. A stretch of land, quiet and open, nothing but fields and sky. Built a small house, nothing fancy, just what I needed. Mornings were spent fixing fences, feeding cattle, watching the sun crawl up over the hills. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching it go back down. No drama. No noise. Just good, honest work and the satisfaction of knowing I'd done things my way. Sarah visited more often. She'd bring the grandkids, let them run wild in the fields, tell me about her life like we hadn't wasted years not talking. I never said it out loud, but I figured she knew, this right here, this was the part that mattered. Not what we lost, but what we still had. One afternoon, Caleb stopped by, still wearing his uniform, looking older, more settled in the job. He leaned against the porch railing, sipping the beer I handed him, eyes scanning the horizon. "Quiet out here," he said. "That's the point." He smirked. "You miss it." I thought about that. The job, the town, the weight of responsibility I'd carried for so damn long. "Nah," I said. "Did my part." He nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. Not long after, I got word Anita had moved out of state. Some cousin of hers mentioned she was bouncing from job to job, barely making ends meet. I didn't ask for details. Didn't need them. She'd made her bed, and I'd made damn sure I wasn't in it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned that deep orange red that always made me stop and watch, I poured myself a drink and sat back in my chair. A man can only control so much in this life. But the things he can? He damn well better handle them right. I tipped my hat back, took a slow sip, and smiled. I'd handled mine.